Millionaire marries a street vendor to win a bet, and her transformation leaves him speechless. But before the start of the story, comment below, which country are you watching us from right now? Please enjoy the video. Ethan, a self-made millionaire, had everything: money, status, and an ego to match. But one careless night, fueled by arrogance and surrounded by his equally privileged friends, he made a wager that would upend his life. The dare was simple: marry someone chosen at random. For a man like Ethan, it was just a game, a trivial way to prove his dominance. On the crowded streets below, Maria was selling flowers, her hands weathered and her spirit unbroken despite the odds stacked against her. She wasn't looking for a savior, she was too busy surviving. But when Ethan stepped into her world with a cold, calculated proposition, her life took an unimaginable turn. What starts as a reckless gamble quickly spirals into something neither of them expects. Ethan's bet, Maria's grit, and the collision of their vastly different worlds ignite a story of transformation, heartbreak, and redemption. The question is, when the truth comes out, who will be left standing? Ethan Montgomery's life was the kind most people only dream about. At just 32 years old, he was already a self-made tech millionaire, with a sprawling mansion, a fleet of luxury cars, and a reputation as a man who could achieve anything he set his mind to. But for Ethan, the thrill of success had dulled. His days were filled with endless meetings, high-stakes deals, and nights of extravagance that left him feeling hollow. His social circle, made up of equally privileged friends, thrived on one thing: dares. Not harmless pranks, but outrageous, ego-driven challenges that fed their desire for constant excitement. One fateful evening, Ethan found himself lounging on the terrace of an exclusive rooftop bar, surrounded by his closest friends. The city below sparkled with lights, a stark contrast to the dark boredom that had crept into their conversations. The champagne flowed freely, loosening tongues and inhibitions, until one friend leaned in with a smirk that carried the promise of chaos. "Ethan," he said, drawing out the name like a taunt, "I bet you wouldn't dare marry someone random. Someone off the street. Prove you've got the guts to really shake things up." The table erupted into laughter, but Ethan didn't join in. His piercing blue eyes scanned the city below, his mind racing with the possibilities. A bet like this was reckless, even by his standards. But wasn't that exactly the kind of thrill he craved? "What's the prize?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but laced with intrigue. "Bragging rights," another friend replied, still chuckling. "And the satisfaction of knowing you've done something no one else would dare." Ethan's gaze landed on a street vendor standing at a busy intersection below. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with a face that carried the weight of exhaustion yet radiated an undeniable strength. Her hands were rough, her clothes worn, but there was a quiet dignity in the way she moved. She was selling flowers, weaving between impatient cars and pedestrians, her arms full of delicate blooms that seemed at odds with the harsh reality around her. "That one," Ethan said, pointing toward the vendor. His friends followed his gaze and burst into laughter, unable to believe he was serious. But Ethan's mind was already made up. The next morning, Ethan stepped out of his world of luxury and into the bustling chaos of the city streets. Dressed in a tailored suit and polished shoes, he stood out like a sore thumb. But his confidence was unshakable. He found the vendor, Maria, at her usual spot, her arms laden with flowers and her eyes scanning the crowd for potential customers. "I have a business proposal for you," Ethan said, his voice crisp and businesslike. Maria froze, startled by the sudden attention from a man who clearly didn't belong in her world. She studied him cautiously, unsure if he was serious or simply mocking her. "I want you to marry me," he continued, handing her an envelope filled with cash. "It's a short-term arrangement. 1 year. Nothing more." Maria's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the envelope. It was more money than she'd ever seen in her life. Enough to pay her mother's mounting medical bills, cover the rent that was months overdue, and send her younger brother back to school. But the proposal was absurd. Marry a stranger? What kind of man would suggest something so outlandish? "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Why me?" Ethan's answer was cold and calculating. "Because I need someone who's completely removed from my world. Someone who won't ask questions or complicate things." Maria's instincts screamed at her to walk away. But desperation silenced those instincts. Her mother's fragile health loomed over her like a storm cloud, and this man, this stranger, was offering her a way out. With trembling hands, she took the envelope and nodded. The wedding was a farce, held in a sterile courthouse with no friends or family present. Maria wore a borrowed dress that didn't quite fit, while Ethan stood by her side in a designer suit, his expression unreadable. To him, this was just another business deal. To Maria, it was a lifeline. Their early days as husband and wife were awkward and distant. Maria moved into Ethan's sprawling mansion, a place so large and cold it felt more like a museum than a home. She stayed in a guest room, their lives running parallel but never intersecting. Ethan went about his days as though she didn't exist, while Maria did her best to navigate the unfamiliar world of wealth and privilege. Ethan's friends, however, weren't as indifferent. They treated Maria like an oddity, a curiosity to be examined and ridiculed. "So, this is the wife," one of them said during a party, his tone dripping with condescension. Maria bit her tongue and smiled politely, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Despite the humiliation, Maria carried herself with quiet dignity. She threw herself into learning, reading books on etiquette and self-improvement, determined not to let their scorn define her. Ethan couldn't help but notice. At first, it was little things, the way she held her head high even when mocked, the way she refused to let the opulence around her intimidate her. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to see something deeper. Maria wasn't just surviving, she was thriving in her own quiet way. And for the first time, Ethan felt the stirrings of something he couldn't quite name, a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and guilt. But the bet loomed over them both, an unspoken truth that threatened to unravel everything. Would Maria's resilience be enough to withstand the weight of Ethan's deception? Or would the truth destroy whatever fragile connection had begun to form between them? Ethan Montgomery wasn't a man who heard no often. He thrived on challenges, thrived on winning. The bet his friends proposed, a random marriage to a street vendor, felt like a joke at first. But something about the absurdity of it appealed to him. It wasn't about love, nor even about proving something to himself. It was about the thrill of doing something no one else dared. And so, the morning after the bet was made, Ethan found himself standing on the corner of a crowded street, scanning the bustling crowd for his unwitting partner. Maria was hard to miss. Her arms were full of flowers, bright bursts of color that seemed almost out of place against the city's gray chaos. She moved quickly, darting between cars and pedestrians, her voice steady as she called out her prices. Every sale mattered. Every coin she earned was another step toward keeping her family afloat. Ethan approached her with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything in his life. "Maria," he said, reading her name from the small badge pinned to her shirt, "I have a proposition for you." Maria looked up, startled. Men like Ethan didn't belong in her world, and they certainly didn't stop to talk to her. "I'm working," she said, her tone polite but wary. "I'll pay you for your time," Ethan replied, holding up a crisp $100 bill. Curiosity got the better of her. She followed him to a quieter corner, where he explained his proposition. 1 year of marriage, no strings attached, in exchange for financial security for her and her family. He handed her an envelope stuffed with cash, more than Maria had ever seen in her life. Maria stared at the money, her heart pounding. It was enough to cover her mother's hospital bills, enough to pay their rent, enough to send her younger brother back to school. But the price? Marry a stranger? The whole idea was absurd, but desperation silenced her doubts. "Why me?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. Ethan's answer was as cold as his demeanor. "Because you're perfect for this. You have nothing to lose, and I have everything to gain." The next day they were married. The ceremony was a formality, held in a quiet courthouse with no guests, no celebration, and no emotion. Maria wore a borrowed dress that didn't quite fit, and Ethan barely looked at her. To him, it was a transaction, a bet he was determined to win. From the moment Maria moved into Ethan's mansion, the differences between their worlds became painfully clear. The house was massive, with marble floors that echoed her every step and rooms so large they felt empty even when fully furnished. Maria stayed in a guest room, her presence in the house almost invisible. Ethan, true to his word, kept his distance. He was polite but detached, treating her more like a business partner than a wife. Maria, meanwhile, struggled to adjust. The luxury around her was overwhelming, but it didn't erase the shame she felt. She didn't belong in Ethan's world, and his friends made sure she knew it. At a dinner party just weeks after the wedding, Ethan's friends openly mocked Maria. "So, this is your wife?" one of them sneered, looking her up and down as if she were an exhibit. Maria smiled politely, refusing to let their words break her. But that night, alone in her room, the tears came. Despite the humiliation, Maria didn't let herself crumble. Instead, she turned her pain into determination. If she was going to live in this world, she would do so on her own terms. She began reading books on etiquette and business, watching videos on how to navigate high society events. Slowly but surely, she began to transform. Ethan couldn't help but notice. At first, it was little things. The way Maria carried herself at events, the way she spoke with quiet confidence. But then there were bigger moments. Like the time she stepped in during a tense business meeting, using her street-smart instincts to suggest a solution that left Ethan's colleagues impressed. For Ethan, it was a revelation. Maria wasn't just surviving in his world, she was thriving. She had a strength and resilience that he had never seen before, and it both unsettled and intrigued him. But the truth of their arrangement loomed over them. Maria had no idea that their marriage was the result of a bet, and Ethan couldn't bring himself to tell her. The guilt gnawed at him, even as he found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't anticipated. Their relationship began to shift. Ethan started spending more time with Maria, learning about her past, her dreams, and the struggles she had faced. Maria, in turn, began to see glimpses of the man behind the wealth, the man who was lonely and burdened by the expectations of those around him. But just as they began to grow closer, the truth came out. Maria overheard Ethan's friends talking about the bet, their laughter ringing in her ears like a cruel reminder of her place in his world. That night, Maria confronted Ethan. "Was it all a lie?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger and betrayal. Ethan tried to explain, but the damage was done. Maria packed her things and left, choosing her dignity over his wealth. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt the sting of real loss. In the days that followed, Ethan was forced to confront the man he had become. He realized that Maria had given him something no amount of money could buy: a sense of purpose, a glimpse of what it meant to truly care for someone. Maria, meanwhile, returned to her roots, but she was no longer the same woman. The experience had changed her, giving her a newfound confidence and determination. She started her own business, using the skills she had learned to build a better life for herself and her family. Ethan, unable to stay away, reached out to Maria. But this time, it wasn't with an offer or a proposition. It was with an apology and a promise to do better. Their story didn't end with a perfect happily ever after, but it did end with hope. Ethan and Maria found their way back to each other, not as strangers bound by a bet, but as equals who had both learned the value of love, respect, and second chances. Maria's world was a bustling chaos of honking cars, shouting vendors, and dusty streets. Every morning, she stood at her usual corner, arms laden with fresh flowers, her voice calling out to potential buyers. It wasn't just a job, it was her lifeline. Every sale put food on the table for her family and paid for her mother's medication. The thought of letting them down was unbearable, and so she endured the heat, the exhaustion, and the occasional rude customer with quiet determination. Ethan's world, by contrast, was one of quiet luxury. His sprawling mansion sat on a hill, surrounded by manicured gardens and guarded gates. Inside, the rooms were filled with priceless art and furniture that no one dared to touch. His life seemed perfect to outsiders, but Ethan knew better. Beneath the polished surface was a gnawing emptiness, a boredom that even his wealth couldn't cure. When Maria moved into Ethan's home after their transactional wedding, it was like stepping into another universe. She was overwhelmed by the sheer size of the mansion, the gleaming surfaces, and the silence that filled every room. For someone used to the constant noise of the streets, the quiet felt oppressive. Her small guest room, though luxurious by her standards, felt more like a gilded cage than a home. Ethan barely noticed her presence at first. He was used to getting what he wanted without much effort, and Maria was just another piece of his carefully curated life. To him, she was a temporary inconvenience, a pawn in a game he intended to win. He spent his days at work and his evenings at exclusive events, leaving Maria to navigate his world on her own. Maria's struggles didn't end with Ethan's indifference. His friends, who had been amused by the ridiculousness of the bet, treated her like an outsider. They whispered behind her back, made snide comments about her clothes, and smirked at her awkward attempts to fit in. "Do you think she even knows how to use silverware properly?" one of them joked during a dinner party. Maria heard every word but refused to let them see her pain. Instead, she focused on learning. She stayed up late watching videos on etiquette, reading books about high society, and practicing her English until it was flawless. If they wanted to mock her, she would give them no reason to. Ethan began to notice these changes, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what was different. At first, it was small things. The way Maria held herself at events, the confidence in her voice when she spoke. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. Maria wasn't just surviving in his world, she was adapting, thriving even. One evening, Ethan found himself watching Maria from across the room as she engaged in a conversation with one of his business associates. She spoke with poise, her words measured and thoughtful. The associate nodded, clearly impressed. Ethan felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, admiration, perhaps, or guilt. His friends noticed too. Their jokes about Maria became less frequent, replaced by grudging respect. "Your wife's pretty sharp," one of them admitted during a poker night. Ethan didn't respond, but the words stuck with him. Despite the outward progress, the weight of the bet hung over Ethan like a dark cloud. He knew he should tell Maria the truth, but every time he tried, the words caught in his throat. How could he admit that their entire marriage was built on a lie? Maria, for her part, began to suspect that something was amiss. Ethan's friends occasionally let slip comments that didn't add up, and Ethan himself seemed uncomfortable whenever she brought up their future. She decided not to press him, choosing instead to focus on her own growth. Her breakthrough came during one of Ethan's business meetings. His company was in the middle of a crisis, with a major deal threatening to fall apart. Ethan's team was stumped, and tensions in the room were high. Maria, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, hesitated before speaking up. "Have you considered simplifying the terms of the agreement?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. "Sometimes people just want to feel like they're getting a fair deal, even if it means a smaller profit margin." The room fell silent. Ethan's colleagues exchanged skeptical glances, but Ethan himself was intrigued. "Go on," he said, motioning for her to continue. Maria outlined her idea, drawing on her experience as a street vendor to explain how small compromises could lead to bigger gains in the long run. By the time she finished, the tension in the room had eased, and Ethan's team was nodding in agreement. The deal was saved, and Ethan's respect for Maria grew. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a strategist, someone who could see opportunities where others saw obstacles. For the first time, Ethan began to wonder if their marriage could be more than just a bet. But the truth had a way of revealing itself, and Ethan's secret couldn't stay hidden forever. One evening, Maria overheard a conversation between Ethan and one of his friends. "I can't believe you actually pulled it off," the friend said, laughing. "Marrying a street vendor for a bet? You're insane." Maria's world shattered. The strength she had built, the respect she had earned, it all felt like a cruel joke. That night, she confronted Ethan, her voice shaking with anger and betrayal. "Was it all a lie?" she demanded, tears streaming down her face. Ethan tried to explain, but Maria wouldn't hear it. She packed her things and left, choosing her dignity over his wealth. For Ethan, it was a wake-up call. The woman he had once dismissed as a pawn had become the most important person in his life, and he had destroyed her trust. In the weeks that followed, Ethan tried to make amends. He donated to charities in Maria's name, supported her family financially, and even cut ties with the friends who had started the bet. But none of it mattered if Maria wouldn't forgive him. Maria, meanwhile, began to rebuild her life. She used the skills she had learned during her time with Ethan to start her own business, a small flower shop that quickly became a success. She wasn't the same woman Ethan had met on the street. She was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. Eventually, Ethan reached out to Maria, not with a proposition or a plea, but with an apology. He admitted his mistakes, owning up to the hurt he had caused. Maria listened, her expression unreadable. "You can't undo the past," she said finally. "But maybe you can prove you've changed." Their story didn't end with a perfect fairy tale, but it did end with hope. Ethan and Maria found a way to move forward, not as strangers bound by a bet, but as equals who had learned the value of love, trust, and second chances. Maria had always been a fighter. Life had given her little, but she had made the most of it, surviving day by day on the chaotic streets. However, entering Ethan's world was unlike anything she had faced before. The sprawling mansion, gleaming marble floors, and cavernous silence of the hallways felt cold and intimidating. Yet Maria was determined not to let her new surroundings overwhelm her. This wasn't just survival. It was a challenge to prove she belonged, even if she didn't fully understand why Ethan had chosen her. Ethan, for his part, barely noticed Maria's efforts. Their arrangement was strictly business in his mind, and he had little interest in what she did with her time. He was polite but distant, treating her more like a guest than a wife. Maria, though, was far from idle. Each day, she explored the mansion, learning its rhythms and understanding the intricacies of Ethan's world. She watched how people interacted at the social events she was now required to attend. These gatherings were filled with Ethan's peers, powerful, wealthy individuals who spoke in coded language and subtle power plays that Maria struggled to decipher. The humiliation came quickly. At her first event, Maria arrived wearing a modest dress, one of the few pieces of formal wear she owned. The whispers started almost immediately. "Is that his wife?" one woman murmured, her voice dripping with disbelief. "She looks so plain," another added, laughing softly. Maria felt the sting of their words, but she kept her head high. She had endured worse on the streets, where rejection and cruelty were common. That night, she stayed in her room long after Ethan had gone to bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her resilience burned brighter than her pain. If they thought she didn't belong, she would prove them wrong. Maria began to transform herself quietly. She started reading books from Ethan's expansive library, focusing on etiquette, social behavior, and communication skills. She watched videos online, practicing her posture, her speech, and even how to hold a wine glass properly. She listened intently during Ethan's phone calls, picking up on the language of business and the subtleties of negotiation. What she lacked in formal education, she made up for with determination and a sharp mind. One day, Ethan noticed her sitting in the study with an open book on high society etiquette. He paused for a moment, intrigued. "What are you doing?" he asked. Maria looked up, startled. "Learning," she said simply, closing the book. "If I'm going to be part of your world, I need to understand it." Ethan didn't respond, but something about her quiet determination struck him. He had expected Maria to fade into the background, to endure their arrangement with silent compliance. Instead, she was challenging herself, growing in ways he hadn't anticipated. He began to see her differently, not as a charity case or a pawn in his game, but as someone with an unyielding will. Maria's first major triumph came during a dinner party Ethan hosted for his business associates. By now, she had upgraded her wardrobe and carried herself with newfound confidence. When one of the guests asked her a question about Ethan's latest venture, Maria hesitated for only a moment before replying. "I'm not involved in the business," she said, her voice steady, "but I've learned that innovation isn't just about creating something new. It's about understanding what people truly need and finding better ways to deliver it." The room fell silent for a moment, and then one of the guests nodded in agreement. "That's a smart perspective," he said. "Ethan, you've got a sharp partner here." Ethan was caught off guard. He hadn't expected Maria to contribute, let alone impress his colleagues. For the first time, he began to wonder if there was more to her than he had ever bothered to see. As Maria grew more comfortable in her role, her influence on Ethan's life became undeniable. One day, during a critical business meeting, Ethan found himself at an impasse. His team couldn't agree on a strategy, and tensions were high. Maria, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, cleared her throat. "May I say something?" she asked cautiously. Ethan hesitated, but his curiosity won out. "Go ahead," he said. Maria leaned forward, her hands clasped. "Sometimes, the simplest solution is the best one. What if you focus on what your customers actually need instead of trying to outdo your competitors? If you can create value for them, they'll stay loyal no matter what anyone else offers." The room was silent for a moment, and then one of Ethan's senior advisors nodded. "She's got a point," he said. "We've been overcomplicating things." The meeting ended with a renewed sense of direction, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a spark of pride. Maria had done more than contribute, she had shifted the entire conversation. But Maria's transformation wasn't just about impressing others. It was about reclaiming her sense of self. For years, she had defined herself by her struggles, by the endless fight to keep her family afloat. Now, she was discovering a new identity, one that was strong, capable, and unafraid to take up space in a world that had tried to exclude her. As Ethan watched Maria grow, he found himself grappling with his own feelings. The bet that had seemed so harmless now felt like a cruel joke. He had underestimated Maria, reducing her to a stereotype, and now he was faced with the reality of her strength. He began spending more time with her, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest. They talked late into the night about their lives, their dreams, and the choices that had led them to this strange arrangement. For Maria, these conversations were bittersweet. She was beginning to see a side of Ethan that he rarely showed, the vulnerable, thoughtful man behind the wealth and bravado. But she couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that there was something he wasn't telling her. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Maria turned to Ethan. "Why did you choose me?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "Because you deserved a chance," he said finally, his voice tinged with guilt. Maria didn't press further, but the doubt lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something that could unravel everything they had built. As Maria's transformation continued, the lines between their worlds began to blur. Ethan's friends, once dismissive and cruel, began to see her in a new light. They stopped mocking her and started seeking her opinion, impressed by her insights and composure. Maria had gone from being an outsider to a respected presence in their circle. But for Maria, the real victory wasn't in earning their approval, it was in proving to herself that she belonged. She had risen above their judgment, not by changing who she was, but by embracing her strengths and refusing to let their scorn define her. The transformation was undeniable, but the shadow of Ethan's secret loomed large. Maria's resilience had inspired Ethan to reconsider his values, but he knew that the truth could destroy everything they had built. The question was no longer whether Maria could thrive in his world. It was whether their fragile connection could survive the weight of his deception. The transformation Maria had undergone was nothing short of extraordinary. From a humble street vendor to a poised and confident figure who could command respect in any room, she had become someone Ethan never expected. But beneath the surface of their fragile connection lay a truth that neither had confronted. Their marriage was a sham, a cruel bet born from Ethan's arrogance. And secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of surfacing at the worst possible moments. Maria's days were no longer filled with uncertainty and survival. She had carved a place for herself in Ethan's world, not through wealth or privilege, but through sheer determination and intelligence. Her presence was no longer ignored or mocked. Even Ethan's closest friends now spoke of her with admiration. She had gained their respect, but there was one person whose approval she valued most, Ethan. Over the weeks, their interactions had shifted. Ethan, once distant and indifferent, had become warmer, more attentive. They shared quiet evenings on the balcony, long conversations that revealed Ethan's hidden vulnerabilities. Maria began to see a side of him that felt genuine, even kind. But even as their bond grew, an unspoken tension lingered. Maria sensed that Ethan was holding something back, and her instincts told her it was important. The breaking point came during a lavish party at Ethan's mansion, a gathering of the city's elite. Maria, now a vision of elegance in a sleek gown, moved through the crowd with confidence. She exchanged pleasantries, offered thoughtful insights in conversations, and even charmed a few skeptical guests who had once dismissed her. Ethan watched her from across the room, his chest swelling with pride and guilt. It was during this party that Maria overheard the conversation that changed everything. Ethan's closest friend, a man named Daniel, was speaking to another guest in hushed tones, but his words carried across the room. "Can you believe he actually went through with it? Marrying her for a bet? I mean, she's impressive now, sure, but at the start? It was all just a game to Ethan." Maria froze. The words hit her like a blow. A bet? She felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the truth began to unravel in her mind. Everything Ethan's proposal, their marriage, his sudden interest in her, was it all a lie? She didn't confront Ethan immediately. Instead, she excused herself from the party and locked herself in her room. Anger, humiliation, and heartbreak swirled within her. Every kind gesture, every warm smile Ethan had offered suddenly felt tainted. The man she had begun to trust, perhaps even care for, had betrayed her in the cruelest way. That night, as the party wound down, Ethan knocked on Maria's door. "Maria? Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Maria opened the door, her face pale but composed. "We need to talk," she said, her tone sharp and unwavering. Ethan followed her into the room, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Maria turned to face him, her eyes blazing with fury and pain. "Is it true?" she demanded. "Was this marriage just a bet to you?" Ethan's heart sank. He had dreaded this moment, but now that it was here, he had no idea what to say. "Maria, Don't lie to me," she interrupted. "I overheard Daniel tonight. He said you married me for a bet. Tell me the truth and—" Ethan's silence was answer enough. Maria's hands clenched into fists, her body trembling as the weight of his betrayal settled over her. "You used me," she said, her voice breaking. "You humiliated me, all for some childish game." "It wasn't like that," Ethan said quickly, his words tumbling out in desperation. "At first, yes, it was a bet. But things changed, Maria. You changed me. I never expected to feel this way about you." Maria shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You think that makes it better? You think I care that you'd feel something now? You built this entire relationship on a lie, Ethan. How can I ever trust you again?" Ethan reached out to her, but Maria stepped back. "Don't," she said, her voice cold. "You don't get to fix this with an apology. I gave up everything to be with you, and you made a fool of me." The next morning, Maria packed her belongings and left the mansion. She returned to her old neighborhood, to the small apartment she had once shared with her mother and brother. But she wasn't the same woman who had stood on the street corner selling flowers. Maria was stronger now, and she refused to let Ethan's betrayal define her. Over the following weeks, Maria focused on rebuilding her life. She used the knowledge and skills she had gained during her time with Ethan to start her own business, a flower shop that quickly became a local success. Her resilience and determination earned her respect in her community, and for the first time in a long time, Maria felt in control of her destiny. Ethan, meanwhile, was left to confront the consequences of his actions. Without Maria, the mansion felt emptier than ever. The bet, once a source of amusement, now filled him with shame. He realized that he had taken Maria's trust and strength for granted, and in doing so, he had lost something irreplaceable. Ethan tried to make amends. He reached out to Maria, but she refused to take his calls. He donated to charities that supported women in need, hoping to atone for his mistakes. But none of it felt like enough. Ethan knew that words and gestures couldn't undo the pain he had caused. Eventually, Ethan decided to visit Maria in person. He found her at her flower shop, bustling with customers and filled with vibrant blooms. Maria looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice calm but guarded. "I came to apologize," Ethan said, his voice heavy with regret. "Not to ask for forgiveness or to make excuses. I just need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." Maria studied him for a moment, her gaze searching. "You can't undo what you did, Ethan," she said. "But I've moved on. I'm building a life I'm proud of, and I don't need your guilt weighing me down." Ethan nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I'm glad you're doing well," he said quietly. "You deserve it." As Ethan turned to leave, Maria called after him. "Ethan." He paused, looking back at her. "What you did hurt me more than you'll ever know. But I hope you've learned something from it. I hope you'll be better." Ethan nodded again, tears welling in his eyes. "I'll try," he said. Maria watched him go, her heart heavy but resolute. She didn't know if she would ever fully forgive Ethan, but she knew one thing for certain: she was stronger now than she had ever been. And no one could take that away from her. The weeks after Maria left Ethan were filled with silence. The sprawling mansion, once alive with the quiet strength of her presence, now felt hollow and cold. Ethan wandered through its echoing halls, consumed by regret. He had everything: money, power, influence, but without Maria, it all felt meaningless. The bet, which had once seemed like a harmless game, now weighed on him like a boulder, reminding him of the pain he had caused. Maria, meanwhile, threw herself into rebuilding her life. The betrayal had hurt her deeply, but she refused to let it define her. She started her own flower shop, using the skills and knowledge she had gained during her time with Ethan. Her business grew quickly, becoming a beloved fixture in the community. Customers were drawn not just by the beauty of her arrangements but by Maria's warmth and determination, which shone through in everything she did. But even as she built her new life, Maria couldn't fully shake the memories of Ethan. Late at night, when the shop was quiet, she found herself wondering about him. Did he regret what he had done? Or had he moved on as she was trying to? Ethan, however, was far from moving on. The loss of Maria forced him to confront parts of himself he had long ignored. He began questioning his choices, his values, and the emptiness that had driven him to make such a cruel bet in the first place. For the first time in his life, Ethan wanted to change, not for anyone else, but because he could no longer live with who he had become. The first step in his redemption was cutting ties with the people who had encouraged his worst impulses. Ethan stopped attending their parties, distancing himself from the toxic circle that had normalized cruelty and arrogance. His former friends mocked him, calling him soft, but Ethan didn't care. He had seen the cost of their games, and he wanted no part of it anymore. Next, Ethan turned his attention to making amends. He began donating to organizations that supported women entrepreneurs, hoping to provide opportunities for others like Maria. He also launched a mentorship program within his company aimed at helping employees from underprivileged backgrounds rise through the ranks. These actions didn't erase his guilt, but they gave him a sense of purpose he had never felt before. Despite his efforts, Ethan knew that the one person he truly wanted to make amends with might never forgive him. Still, he decided to try. One day, he visited Maria's flower shop, his heart pounding as he stepped inside. The sight of her, busy arranging a bouquet, took his breath away. She looked stronger, more radiant than ever. Maria noticed him immediately, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone calm but guarded. "I came to apologize," Ethan said, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "Not to ask for forgiveness or to explain myself, just to tell you that I'm sorry. For everything." Maria put down the flowers she was holding, her eyes fixed on him. "You can't undo what you did, Ethan," she said. "You hurt me. You made me feel like a pawn in your game." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice heavy with regret. "And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But meeting you changed me, Maria. You made me see how empty my life was, how shallow my choices were. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that." Maria studied him for a moment, her gaze searching. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the weight of his guilt. "I've moved on, Ethan," she said finally. "I'm building a life I'm proud of, and I don't need your guilt or your redemption to validate it." "I understand," Ethan said quietly. "I'm glad you're doing well. You deserve every bit of success." As Ethan turned to leave, Maria stopped him. "Ethan," she said, her voice softer now. "What you did was wrong, but I hope you've learned from it. I hope you'll be better." Ethan nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I'll try," he said before walking out of the shop. The encounter left both of them with mixed emotions. For Maria, it was a reminder of the pain she had endured but also of her strength in overcoming it. For Ethan, it was a moment of clarity, a realization that redemption wasn't about erasing the past but about committing to being better in the future. In the months that followed, both Ethan and Maria continued to grow in their separate lives. Maria's flower shop expanded, and she became a mentor to young women in her community, sharing the lessons she had learned about resilience and self-worth. Ethan, meanwhile, transformed his company's culture, focusing on empathy, fairness, and opportunity. Eventually, their paths crossed again at a charity event Maria had been invited to speak at. Ethan, sitting quietly in the audience, watched as she shared her story of overcoming hardship and finding strength in herself. Her words moved him deeply, not just because of their truth but because of the hope they carried. After the event, Ethan approached Maria, unsure if she would even want to speak to him. To his surprise, she smiled. "You've been busy," she said, a hint of warmth in her voice. "So have you," Ethan replied. "Your speech was incredible." Maria nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe we've both learned something?" "Maybe," Ethan agreed. Though their relationship would never return to what it once was, there was a sense of peace between them now, a mutual respect forged through pain and growth. Ethan and Maria had both found redemption, not through each other but through the lessons they had taught themselves. As they parted ways that evening, Ethan felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. Maria, too, felt lighter, knowing that the man who had once hurt her was now striving to be better. Their story wasn't about a perfect ending, but about the power of transformation, resilience, and the ability to rise above the mistakes of the past. Ethan and Maria's journey was far from conventional. It began as a shallow gamble, an impulsive bet born out of boredom and privilege. But what unfolded was a story neither could have anticipated, a tale of transformation, resilience, and the human capacity for change. Ethan, a man consumed by arrogance and a sense of invincibility, was forced to confront the emptiness of his life and the consequences of his actions. Maria, a woman whose strength and determination had carried her through life's harshest trials, refused to let betrayal define her. Together, they embarked on a journey that would forever alter the course of their lives. Maria's transformation from a street vendor to a confident, self-reliant business owner was a testament to her grit and resolve. Despite the humiliation and heartbreak she endured, she rose above it, building a life she could be proud of. Her story was not about being saved by wealth or power, but about discovering her own worth and forging her own path. For Ethan, Maria became a mirror, reflecting the flaws he had long ignored. Her resilience forced him to confront the privilege and carelessness that had shaped his decisions. In losing Maria, Ethan found himself, discovering a sense of purpose and empathy that had eluded him for years. His redemption was not instant or easy, but a slow, deliberate process of making amends and becoming a better man. Their paths, though separate, remained intertwined by the lessons they had learned from one another. Ethan's remorse and Maria's forgiveness were not about erasing the past but about moving forward with the wisdom gained from their shared experiences. In the end, their story was not a perfect fairy tale but a powerful reminder of the complexities of human relationships. It was a story about growth, accountability, and the redemptive power of resilience. Ethan and Maria's lives may have diverged, but the impact they had on each other was indelible, a testament to the fact that even the most unlikely beginnings can lead to profound transformations. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales, or watch our next video to discover another journey of resilience and transformation.